National 9/11 Pentagon Memorial Podcast, where it is our mission to always remember and never forget.
Good morning. In today's episode, we're featuring Dr. Sarandis Randy Papadopoulos, a distinguished historian with deep expertise in military history and a specialized focus on the Pentagon and its role in national security and the attack of 9/11. Dr. Papadopoulos serves as a senior strategy analyst with the U.S. Navy staff and has an extensive background in naval history, having served on the Secretariat Historian for the Department of the Navy and contributed significantly to the Navy Heritage Campaign. Dr. Papadopoulos' academic journey began at the University of Toronto, followed by advanced degrees from the University of Alabama and George Washington University, where he studied under Ronald Spector. His work, particularly as a co-author of Pentagon 9/11, provides critical insights into the events of September 11th and their impact at the Pentagon. In our discussion, we'll explore the morning of September 11th, 2001, and the challenges that were presented to the people there, the immediate response to the attack itself, and the architectural and operational factors that influenced the aftermath. Dr. Papadopoulos' contributions to military history have been recognized through various awards, and his role in organizations such as the Society for Military History and the U.S. Commission on Military History underscore his commitment to the field. As we navigate through our conversation, Dr. Papadopoulos' expertise will shed light on 9/11 and the Pentagon attack specifically. And I must say, Dr. Papadopoulos, that for the Pentagon Memorial Fund community, this book, Pentagon 9/11, is a go-to reference for all of us. It's so helpful in just understanding the day and what happened. So we're really looking forward to the discussion, and welcome to our podcast.
Well, thank you very much for having me today, Mr. McCarthy. It's a real privilege to have the chance to talk about the book. It's work I did a long time ago, starting work on it over 20 years ago. But it still sticks with me, and I use it, I won't say on a day-to-day basis, but I certainly pay attention to what happened at the Pentagon, and it's always running, as it were, in the background as I think about what happens, since I still do work in the Pentagon. I should note that anything I say today are my personal remarks, not those of my employer, the United States Navy, or the Department of Defense, or the United States government. But nonetheless, you can't separate yourself from your past experience, and the Pentagon attack is part of a large collective shared experience in the past, and it is running in the background, sort of I pay attention to it all the time, and so I'm very pleased to be here today.
Great. So I think a good place for us to start, just as the book does, is to talk about the Pentagon itself. For people in the military or those who live around the Pentagon, I think we have some familiarity with its history and its purpose. But could you just kind of give the background from your experience working there and from the book on the Pentagon itself?
Yeah. Fundamentally, and the thing that sort of surprises people, that everybody thinks of it as a vast, mysterious place, and it is big, so it is vast. But it's not mysterious. It's an office building. It's a low-rise office building. It's only 5 stories above ground, and a couple of basements and a sub-basement. So it's not a particularly not a particularly unusual building for what people are used to. If you think about something, the hallways are wide, and people think of them as resembling hospital corridors in that regard. But realistically, it's just an office building. It happens to be the biggest office building in the world, and that makes it distinctive, if not unique. It is also, when I say biggest, it is 6.6 million square feet of enclosed space. Roughly 1/3 of that is hallways. The other 2/3 of that is offices and other facilities. So it's a large office building spread out over about 35 acres of area, including the courtyard, and 5 stories tall, with offices on either side. But distinctively, and this is something that people don't realize, if you think of it as one building, it's really 5 buildings, one nested inside the other, because it's actually 5 pentagons, one inside the other. The outermost, the E-ring as it's called, is about 920 feet long on each side. So if you do a lap of one circle around the E-ring, you do about 4/5 of a mile. The inner one is about 450 feet long. So each of those are separated by air shafts, which give you a very distinctive feel for it. The air shafts let in natural light so that you don't have this uniformly dark space inside. You actually have windows that give us some daylight there. There are some exceptions to those rules, but that gives you a pretty good sense. You can also drive into the center of the Pentagon if you have permission to do so, but this will play a role on 9/11 because the firefighters actually fight the fire from the inside of the building, from the center of the building in the courtyard outward, and that makes a huge difference. All of that to support nowadays about 22,000 people. There'll be fewer of them on 9/11 because of the renovations that are going on at the time. But 22,000 people work in the Pentagon with another couple thousand visitors every day coming in for meetings, usually, or for tours.
So that was a point in the book that was very interesting is, can you talk a little bit about this renovation that's going on September 11th, 2001? Because it sort of factors into the story later on, right?
It does. And it's a very important point to bring out, I think, because it really does shape a lot of what happens to people. And it proves to be a challenge on the morning of 9/11. So the Pentagon is actually, you don't want to think of it as a day to 9/11 as a day to celebrate. But the Pentagon groundbreaking took place on 11 September 1941, exactly 60 years to the day before the attack in 2001. And so the building is actually a fairly old structure by then. But 60-year-old office buildings are not typically reused unless they've been seriously renovated. And the Pentagon had been renovated starting in the 1990s. And the idea was, if you think of the Pentagon in its regular pentagonal shape as 5 wedges or slices of a pie, the first wedge was just being finished when the attack took place on 9/11. The idea was to completely gut the interior of the Pentagon right down to the structure, to replace some of the structural problems that had developed with age, to eliminate some of the hazardous materials, lead paint, asbestos, a great fireproofer, but unfortunately it causes cancer. So these things were removed from the Pentagon. And in fact, and in this one particular wedge where coincidentally the plane would strike on 9/11, the offices had been emptied out, the building gutted, rebuilt, and people were actually moving back in to do work in those spaces on 9/11. That was a very expensive process. Congress capped the price initially at $1.2 billion, which sounds like a tremendous amount of money, because it is. But the idea was that this was a 50-year renovation, that it would give, 22,000 office workers a place to work that was safe and comfortable and could also accommodate 21st century IT equipment for the next half century. So that was why that was going, and it was underway on 9/11. Now, why does that make a difference? Well, the answer is, of course, that when there are fewer people in a certain place, in this case, in the first wedge of the Pentagon, and the plane crashes into it, there are fewer people in the way. So it means that there are fewer people hurt or killed because the plane crashed on the emptiest part of the Pentagon that particular day. Where it provided a challenge, unfortunately, was that as a construction site, everybody who was around that construction site really had to deal with unfamiliar surroundings because it had been changed for the renovations, but also because there were construction barriers put up, fencing, plywood walls, blocking hallways, for example. All of those made it difficult to navigate the Pentagon and more confusing for the occupants that day.
And I also read in the book that so on that side of the building, there's a heliport at that time. And in some sense, I didn't know this from the media stories or anything I've studied in the past, but the book sort of references that was in use that day. And so it was staffed and there were people at the heliport, whereas normally it doesn't seem like that was the case. Is that correct?
And the heliport's usually staffed during business hours, but if they're expecting a distinguished visitor, and in this case, the visitor who they were expecting that day was President George W. Bush, because he was going to be flying back from an engagement in Florida and landing at Andrews Air Force Base, then take the helicopter, which is in suburban Maryland, then taking a helicopter from there to the Pentagon and driving over to the White House. They can land at the White House. That day, the White House was not available. So actually, he was expected to be at the Pentagon on the morning of, early afternoon, I guess, of 9/11. Nobody knew about that. That's a fairly closely guarded event at that time. But they certainly had the air traffic control tower staffed, and the firefighting crew that is always there because it is an active airport was there ready just in case somebody else landed in a helicopter as well, and in case there was an accident. So it is a fairly rigorously maintained helipad, and we hear helicopters landing at it all the time. You can see them from the roads the parks surrounding the Pentagon to this day.
So that image we're all familiar with of President Bush finding out about the attacks in Florida, reading to his school children, that's somehow connected to the Pentagon as well, because his trip brought him through that site.
Yeah, or it was to bring him through that site. He did not get there, and of course, until a day later, but under completely different circumstances. Yeah, that's right.
So that sets the stage for the building, and I think we all remember it was a remarkably clear blue day. That's something that everybody brings up about 9/11, I think, that lived through it. The book goes into great detail about what's happening in the air at that point, and the 4 planes that are hijacked for the 3 attack sites. Can you sort of walk us through an understanding of what was happening in the air at that moment in time?
Sure, and it's perhaps apart from the actual events on the ground, that what happens in the air is a completely what makes 9/11 a bit different is what happens in the air, of course. And the hijackers, and there are 19 of them, will hijack 4 airliners, all bound on long flights from the US East Coast to the US West Coast. They pick large airplanes, Boeing 757s and Boeing 767s, because they know that they carry large amounts of fuel and are very heavy to crash into the targets that they've chosen that day. What makes this unusual, and from our perspective, because we've sewn up the security problem that let the hijackers get through, was that at the time there was a hole in the security system that essentially allowed the hijackers to get on board airliners carrying small box cutter knives, very sharp knives that are used to literally cut open the tape on boxes when you're unpackaging things. And these weapons are actually identified in the case of Flight 77, the plane that crashes at the Pentagon. They're identified by the and the bags are actually run through the X-ray machine a second time. There's video of the hijackers doing this, but because they were legal at that time, they were allowed to board the hijackers were allowed to board the planes carrying them, and they were of course used to take control of the airliners. Now the airliners are very big. They're in the case of a Boeing 767, it weighs about, fully loaded, about 140 tons. The 757 that crashes here at the Pentagon weighs about 100 tons. And of that, roughly a quarter on each of those planes is going to be fuel. Very destructive, basically a derivative of kerosene called Jet A. The fuel makes them very potent weapons for doing a lot of destruction on the ground. So basically the planes all start pushing back from their gates at Boston's Logan International Airport, Newark's Liberty International Airport, and Dulles International Airport here in the Washington, D.C. area. Starting at about just before 8 o'clock in the morning, they fly west. The hijackers take control of the planes, and when they do so by simply exploiting something that the pilots had actually been trained to let them do. They would menace basically somebody in the cabin. The hijackers would menace somebody in the cabin with their knives, threaten them, and they would knock and go up to the pilots, the cabin, the cockpit door rather, of the airliner, knock on the door, and the pilots would let them in and let them take control of the planes. That's what the pilots had been trained to do, because that's what hijackers did, and then they would make demands of some sort, release of prisoners somewhere or for money. This is what hijacking had meant. Unfortunately, on 9/11, the hijackers' intent was completely different. At that point, our best estimate is that the pilots are murdered, and the hijackers take control of the planes and start flying them towards their intended targets in New York City and Washington, D.C. Now, the 4 planes are hijacked in quick succession, about 8:15 or 8:20 in the morning, starting at 8:15, 8:20 in the morning, and then finally winding up just after 9:15 in the morning. So everything that happens that we've described so far takes place in the space of maybe an hour and a half. And then the planes fly for another 15 or 20 minutes, sometimes as much as half an hour, to crash into their targets and the 2 cities I mentioned. So that the first plane, American Airlines Flight 11, will crash into the World Trade Center at about 8:46 in the morning. And it's presumed by everybody on the ground that this is some sort of a tragic accident. Nobody really has a very strong inkling that the plane has been hijacked and deliberately flown into the building in New York City as a cruise missile piloted by hijackers. Immediately, every television camera is on the World Trade Center showing there's been a terrible accident in New York City. That's what everybody's telling everybody. That's what the news reports are saying. And then, of course, things change 17 minutes later when United Airlines Flight 175 crashes into the World Trade Center. And everybody realizes this is not just one accident, it is two deliberate attacks on the World Trade Center. And things are happening fast. I mentioned that it's 17 minutes since the first plane had crashed into the World Trade Center when the second plane crashes into the other of the Twin Towers. To give you a sense, though, of how tightly packed in time this is, that second crash takes place just 21 minutes after the fourth plane had launched from Newark's Liberty International Airport, right across the river from Manhattan, less than 20 miles away. So in fact, United Airlines Flight 175 is less than 15 miles from United Airlines Flight 93 when it crashes into the World Trade Center at 9:03. That's a really amazing coincidence in time and space, and makes things very confusing for the people on the ground who are trying to respond to it. Now, the problem is that there are people who are charged with air defense over North America. The North American Aerospace and Defense Command, a combined American and Canadian effort to defend North American airspace. But there are only 14 interceptors on alert across the continent to defend against air attack that morning. And the two planes that are dispatched from Cape Cod, Massachusetts, to respond to the first plane crash over New York City arrive over New York City about 7 minutes too late to be able to intercept the second plane, United Airlines Flight 175. So there's a whole bunch of confusion. Well, what else is causing that confusion? At the time that the second plane crash takes place, the Federal Aviation Administration decides we've got a substantial problem, obviously. We don't know how many planes have been hijacked. Everyone is now coldly aware of what is happening in New York City. Could there be more? Well, there are several planes that are starting to disappear from because their transponders are turned off. That's a very simple way of identifying an airliner, using the radar system to essentially tell where an airliner is. And several planes have started to disappear. In fact, disappear is too strong a word. They're detectable by radar. They're not identifiable by radar the way that an air traffic controller would expect. So nobody knows which American Airlines plane has crashed into the World Trade Center first, and which United Airlines plane has crashed into the World Trade Center second. And where are these other ones? Well, in the case of American Airlines Flight 77, notice this is a different plane. This is the plane that took off from Dulles, and the plane that's going to be the subject of most of today's discussion. Flight 77 had taken off at about 8:30 in the morning, flown west until about 9 o'clock, had been hijacked, and then flown back towards Washington, D.C., where it would crash at about 9:37 in the morning. All of that. Now, remember, we're talking about events that all got in motion just 2 hours earlier. So it's really confusing for the people on the ground, especially when one recognizes that there are a full 4,300 civilian airliners over the continental United States just 10 minutes before Flight 77 crashes here. So if you're trying to pick out which planes out of which are the hijacked ones and are going in the wrong directions and are going to start killing people, it's really very confusing for the people on the ground to try to do anything about it. What that means is that the Air National Guard, even though they try, and they're actually told in the case of two F-16s, actually it's three F-16s that take off from near Norfolk, Virginia, they're told to fly to Washington, D.C., initially to look for American Airlines Flight 11, not Flight 77, that's the plane that actually is going to crash here, but the first plane that had crashed in New York City 45 minutes earlier. By some miscommunication and some reliance on old orders, the pilots are actually about 170 miles away over the North Atlantic Ocean when they get the order to respond in Washington, D.C., and they have 7 minutes to make it here. They can't do that in that time. In fact, the air traffic controllers will tell them, I don't care how many windows you break, they don't go supersonic, but they are ordered to get here as fast as possible, and they arrive here about 8 minutes too late. Again, the hijackers in this case relying upon the surprise of the day to make sure that nobody could stop them from getting to their intended targets. The plane flies, the American Airlines Flight 77, that is, flies eastward, crosses the ring road, the beltway that circles Washington, D.C., just after 9:30, and then executes a really sharp descending turn from about 5,000 feet. As the plane is flying on the last couple of miles before it crashes into the Pentagon, the hijackers push the throttles to their stops to put full power on the plane so it's moving faster, making it more destructive. And as I say, at 9:37, it crashed into the Pentagon at about 460 knots, which is about 530 miles per hour. It weighs about 100 tons at that time, of which 18 tons is fuel. And there are really graphic photographs that we included in the book Pentagon 9/11 that show the impact of the plane when it crashes here. It's a very, very destructive event.
And the fuel is the biggest cause, right? Because I mean, you're carrying this large load of fuel on the plane, and that fuel just moves into the building and sort of ignites, right? So it's the plane's weight is incredible hitting a reinforced structure, but then you're dealing with this fireball that occurs from the jet fuel, as you mentioned, right?
Exactly so. And you're quite right, Mr. McCarthy, because if you think of the fuel, as I say, it's derived like kerosene, the same stuff that you'd use to start an outdoor barbecue. Basically, it's been modified, so actually it shouldn't flash if you throw a match into it. But Jet A is a very volatile fuel, and if you think of it as the nose of the plane hits the outside of the Pentagon, which is a very robust structure. It's made out of stone. It's got a limestone facing, lined with brick, with steel reinforced concrete pillars holding it up. The plane hits the building, but at that tremendous speed that I mentioned. Then you get the fuel wrap, which is mostly stored in the wings of the plane. The fuel very quickly turns into an aerosol, a gas. And as soon as it mixes with the air, with all that metal flying around, all that heat generated from the plane crash, it flashes and turns into what you quite aptly describe as a fireball. Anyone who's seen videos of what happened in New York City with the World Trade Center crashes knows what those fireballs look like. They're huge explosions of fuel, tons of fuel. In most cases, the best estimate that I ever heard in the course of working on the book Pentagon 9/11 was that 1/3 to 2/3 of the fuel caught fire and deflagrated. That's the technical term. It means it burned very quickly outside the Pentagon. It's actually a good thing because it's burning in the open air. The problem is whatever doesn't do that gets inside the Pentagon and starts a tremendous building fire on very large office floors. These are office floors that are about an acre in area on the first and second floor. On the third, fourth, and fifth floors, the air shafts that I mentioned earlier come into play. But on the ground floors, you're dealing with continuous space offices. So these are very large cubicle farms with corridors running down them, in most cases, that are occupied by several hundred people. And that causes a tremendous fire to develop immediately, pushed by this force of the plane. It's not as though you've lit the fire outside the Pentagon and it's just burning outside of it. It's actually the plane has actually punched a hole in the outside wall, bringing the fuel inside with it. As the fuel gets mixed with oxygen, it flashes and catches fire and spreads destruction throughout almost an acre of floor space on both the first and second floors of the Pentagon.
So essentially, the book does a really good job with these oral histories and interviews. It's like a strength of the book that so many people are interviewed about their personal experience within the building. And I was struck by two things. One is, as we talked about the structure, people have a very different experience of impact. Some people even state they're unaware of what's happening, like they don't even know what's happened on the other side of the building. And then the second point is all of the oral histories indicate a very different experience of people in the building near the attack. Like some people are in a hellish inferno almost immediately, and some folks have a way out and sort of are experiencing it from a different way. So can you talk about, must have been very hard for you to do all these interviews, but there must be some that struck you as powerful in terms of what you heard from some of the people who survived the attack.
It's the very important, you raise a very important question, Mr. McCarthy, because I think you have to realize that we did an enormous number of interviews, over 1,300 for the writing of the Pentagon 9/11 book. We didn't use all of them. We used a cross section of them, about 350. But they really do give you a very good sense of what happened to people on that morning. It really did depend on location and a bit of fortune. I hate to say that people were lucky, but if you were far enough away, you were lucky not to get hurt, or at least or even killed by the crash of the plane into the Pentagon. So it's very difficult for us to imagine it. But if you can, if anyone who watches this thinks about it, you imagine you're in a very large office building that's very flat, not tall, and something happens down the way. You hear some noise, and in fact, what people at a great distance heard was they thought some construction equipment, because remember, the Pentagon is being rebuilt this day on this day. They hear, but they think it's construction equipment being dropped in the hallway down the hallway from them. If they're closer, then they notice more subtle changes. They might actually hear the plane crash. What was that? If they knew about New York City, and some knew about New York City from seeing television reports, but it's only been 35 minutes since the second plane had crashed in New York City. So really, a lot of them had no idea, because they were in meetings or they didn't have a television on in their offices. They had no idea of what was going on in New York. But if they were closer, they'd hear a crash and they'd feel the air pressure change around their ears slightly. Maybe they could, if they were closer still yet, they would actually feel a wash of heat pass by, because the fuel was catching fire not too far from them. This would be somebody who'd be very close indeed. And finally, of course, if they were too close, they would actually be in the path of the airliner and the destruction it was causing. And as the plane flew, they would either feel a slight movement of things, smaller objects in their offices, books and papers that they could just start to see. And then there'd be a wave of force coming through, because the plane was pushing the air out of the way in front of it. And of course, what immediately would follow upon that, and here we're talking in fractions of a second, would be the fireball that would follow along. It really did depend on how close people were, to how badly affected they were by these events. For people who were, maybe 50 feet away, they would definitely know the plane had crashed there. But if they were out of the path of the plane, they would feel the heat coming their way. They'd see the smoke, of course, and they would certainly feel all the other changes that I've talked about. The building would be shaking from that, but they would be probably unharmed. If they were any closer than that, however, they would be subject to flash burns, because the fuel, even if it caught fire and then burned out immediately, it would still scorch their skin, akin to something like a very bad sunburn. And of course, if they were closer than that, it would actually set people on fire. That's, of course, the worst thing that could happen to them, because that's, apart from the fact that it's an extremely painful injury, it's a life-threatening. In fact, some of the people who were in the Pentagon were, in an odd way, fortunate, because they were closer to where the plane crashed, and the fuel didn't have time to mix with enough oxygen. So in fact, they were not burned as badly as people who were farther in the Pentagon, where the fuel had more time, in essence, to mix with oxygen and catch fire. But to give you a sense of how hot it was inside the Pentagon that morning, one particular staff member of the Department of the Army, the Army's librarian, actually was wearing a plastic badge used for identification and to get into the building. And when she left the building, she noticed the edges of the badge had curled in the heat from the fire that she had walked through to escape. So it really did make a huge difference about where you were located. And some people were just very fortunate to be located in a safer place where they didn't get hurt as badly, if at all, that morning. Of course, then what really made a difference in terms of how badly injured they were was whether or not somebody came to rescue them. And there were plenty of people who did that as well. We can talk about that perhaps next.
Yeah, so it's incredible, because when you hear the survivors and talking about the attack, I mean, they're faced with the power goes off. They're in a dark room, because there's not a lot of windows in some areas of the Pentagon, right? And they're in unfamiliar surroundings. So they've just started in the office, so they're not And there's some escape routes that are cut off and others are not. So it really is such a challenging situation for those people who actually survive the impact and have to make their way out along the way.
Again, everything in the Pentagon, one has to remember, is done on a large scale. And so the offices, especially on the first and second floors, are very large bays of cubicles, something on the order of 100 feet long by 50 feet wide. Well, with that much space, and remember, the plane just doesn't magically fly through and not disturb it. You mentioned quite properly the lights going out. It's not just the lights going out, it's also the electrical system is cut, the piping is cut. So all of a sudden there's water or sparks moving around inside these office spaces. The rooms are catching fire around people. And the force of the plane, this 100-ton object that is rapidly disintegrating as it flies through the Pentagon, the force of that also starts moving things around: cubicle walls, file cabinets, desks, unfortunately also people, pushing them around, blocking exits in some cases, crippling people and hurting them very badly in others because there are people with broken bones. When the force of the fuel and the crash actually breaks the concrete of the second floor and pushes it upward, which allows some of the flames to get up, some of the fireball to go upward into the second floor, all of these things are taking place in a way that makes it very deadly for people inside the building. And as they try to escape, everything's changed from what they knew. Yes, it's a new office that maybe, or maybe it's their existing office if they're on the other side of the construction barrier, and because the plane actually crosses that construction barrier. But these offices, too, are now blocked off in one direction, so familiar pathways to get to a fire exit just simply aren't available anymore because they're closed off by construction barriers. All of that means that people have faced a very challenging time in a smoky, dark room that's literally on fire around them, trying to get away and save their lives and those of their colleagues. It makes things very difficult. Now, they're helped by a bunch of people in the Pentagon. The Pentagon, I think I've been pretty detailed in saying the Pentagon's just an office building, and it is. But the occupants of the Pentagon are a little bit different because so many of them are military personnel, about 40%, or people who've been in the military who are naturally trained to respond by going into danger and doing something that they need to do. And on that day, they do that. They'll actually go into a burning room to rescue people who are trapped underneath equipment or cubicles or trapped at their desks, or to at least lead people out to a way of safety because they've come from where the air is clear and they know the fire is worse. And so they'll be on the edge of it saying, come this way, it's safe. You can't see through the smoke because the smoke is very dense and is actually blocking out even the sunlight that is coming into the building. But these people are lying on the floor saying, come to the sound of my voice. I know the way to safety, and they lead people to safety. That actually happens with the Undersecretary of the Navy that morning. Her name is Susan Livingstone, and she and a party of about 40 Navy employees managed to escape by people lying on the floor and saying, come down the fourth corridor towards the courtyard to get away from this deadly threat to their lives.
Yeah, and there's even the picture in the book, I think, of Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld carrying a stretcher that day. So it sort of seemed like everybody at the Pentagon turned out to try to help in the first minutes after the attack in any way they could.
Exactly so. Secretary Rumsfeld is indeed photographed. He was filmed by a television crew carrying a stretcher, but he actually did help carry a wounded person to the ambulances on the southwest side of the Pentagon, and so that person could be taken to hospital. No, and the way he described it in his oral history interview was very simple. I just thought it was the thing I should be doing to help out. He did want to see what was happening, of course, because this is the National Military Headquarters, and he had to be able to report to President Bush and to Vice President Cheney what was changing that morning. But his first response may have been to see what's going on outside, but his second response was, I've got to do something to help save this person's life. And so he carries a stretcher that morning as well.
So the book is really helpful in sort of describing the aftermath. Now you have the professional fire response coming to the Pentagon. I think it took minutes, right? They were very quick to respond. Everybody turns out, so you have multiple counties and jurisdictions all trying to fight the fire and get into the building and save people. And yet the book sort of articulates that there's a friction occurring between the impromptu response and the organized professional response, which I think we could all understand that military personnel standing outside the building are impatient, are trying to help. But at the same time, the professional firefighters are trying to organize and fight the fire in the way they're normally going to fight the fire and sort of save people. Can you talk a little bit about what you found in your research on this?
Yeah, and one of the strengths of the book, and one of the reasons that we did over 1,000 interviews for it, was we wanted to make sure we did talk to the civilian responders, firefighters, police, emergency medical technicians, hospital people, and the Federal Emergency Management Agency staff who responded. But the reason that we wanted to do that was we want to see, well, what is the history of a large building fire? There really aren't many books on this subject. Most of them, most history books, I should say, focus on rather tragic events of a century ago. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, a very noted building fire in New York City. A lot of immigrant women killed in that fire. But apart from that, there really aren't that many histories about building fires. It's not a subject, because of the compressed time scale they take place in. It's not something that people typically write history books about. Well, we decided that we wanted, in the course of writing this book, one of the instructions I got, and it's something that we lived up to, was to tell the story from the firefighters' response. And as you pointed out in your question, this is a very federated way of doing firefighting, because Arlington County only has 10 fire stations, and the office building that each of those firefighting crews is either 3 or 4 firefighters. That is nowhere near enough to fight the fire. What is the largest fire that any of these firefighters had ever seen? That's not enough crews to do the job at the Pentagon. And in fact, only 9 of those crews show up. And you're quite right, by the way, they did show up very quickly, because they were only 2 miles away at a high-rise apartment building fire that had been put out, and they were ready to respond immediately. Actually, some of the first firefighters to respond within the first 5 or 6 minutes are from Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport, the major airport in the center of basically the Washington, D.C. area. They get here within 6 minutes, and they carry firefighting foam that is useful for putting out the fuel fire outside the building. They really can't spray it inside the building, because when you spray the foam, it scatters too much and gets blown back at the firefighters. But at least they can put the fire out outside by suppressing the fuel-fed fire. But the firefighters come from all over the place, as you mentioned. Arlington County, Washington, D.C., Alexandria City, Falls Church City, Fairfax County, the largest of the jurisdictions on the Virginia side, plus, of course, Montgomery County and Prince George's County on the Maryland side. Indeed, there'll be 2 fire companies that will show up from North Carolina later that day, having driven all the way up Interstate 95 from that state too. But all of these agencies are trying to respond at once, many of them totally unfamiliar with the Pentagon. The only firefighting response normally at the Pentagon came from Arlington County, because that's where the Pentagon sits. And so as a result, they had to be guided by Pentagon staff, whether it was police or by the Arlington County firefighters. And they literally had to learn the layout of the building to fight the fire effectively from inside. They were helped by the fact that the renovation was taking place, because there were several people who were involved in the renovation process. One, Stacy Condrell, who's a space management official with the Pentagon renovation effort, had maps. And so she could point out and say, you want to go this way, down this hallway, and turn left or turn right. This is where the fire is. And the firefighters could look at those maps and charts and figure out exactly what the layout of what the building looked like before the plane had crashed there. You also quite drew attention to a very important point. The Pentagon was still partly occupied. Secretary Rumsfeld insisted that the National Military Command Center be available, and he stayed in it for the rest of the day. The firefighters asked him to leave. He said, no, I think I should stay. I have to be able to report to the President of the United States what's going on here, as well as pass information I may learn on to his superiors. And he wanted to be able to do that from the National Military Command Center. The firefighters thought it was risky to do so, so they gave him equipment so that he would be safer in making that choice. But at the same time, the firefighters also ran into Pentagon occupants, people who'd rushed into burning rooms to help lead people out or rescue people who were trapped in the wreckage. And the tension that arose was, this is, from the Pentagon occupants, they essentially said, this is a battlefield, to put words in their mouths. This is a battlefield. We've got to get our wounded out. And the firefighters like, leave that to us. It's our job to do. And the response was, no, we want to help you do that job. We know the Pentagon, if nothing else. Mm-hmm. And there was some tension. It was resolved ultimately. Part of the problem that helped resolve it in an odd way was that there was a call that there's a second plane coming. And when that second plane, which was probably Flight 93, was reported to the lead firefighter, Assistant Chief of Arlington County Fire, Jim Swartz. Swartz basically said, pull the firefighters out and get them out. So, because I don't want a plane crashing in. And the Pentagon occupants saw the firefighters leave, they realized, okay, it's time for us to go too. Once that happened, there was sort of a pause. It took about 20 minutes for the all clear to be sounded and the firefighting effort could be resumed. There was a cost for doing that, of course. Swartz knew if anyone was still alive, he might be risking their lives. It was unlikely that his choice actually did that because the fire is just so intense. And those people who could get away did. Those who were still trapped there were probably already gone by the time the evacuation order came at about 10:15 in the morning, 10:20 in the morning. So he had to make a hard choice. He knew exactly what the risks were and he weighed the risks and balanced them. Ultimately, the firefighters come, and there are up to 600 of them servicing the Pentagon fire at that time. What the outer lying suburbs from Washington, D.C. and Loudoun County and Loudoun County, Virginia, and Howard County, Maryland will do is they'll backfill. So they'll put their fire crews into Fairfax and Montgomery counties, respectively, to cover those things in case an emergency should happen elsewhere in the Washington, D.C. area. But it really was a tremendous effort with a very well thought through incident command system that placed Jim Swartz, the lead firefighter, in charge of the firefighting effort. He told firefighters where to go, so you didn't have mixing of agencies that couldn't talk to each other by radio, for example, fighting the fire in the same part of the building. It really was an amazing effort and surprisingly well coordinated with a little bit of advanced preparation and agreements between these two agencies. So they all had trained together and practiced, nothing on this scale to be sure, but they had at least practiced something to be able to respond to something like what happened on 9/11. And it was, in many cases, for the firefighters, the biggest fire they had ever seen in their lives.
Yeah, so we have survivors who are docents at the National 9/11 Pentagon Memorial, and they always speak about that, going back to work the next day and sort of the existing fear. And so it's really interesting that you have the firefighters are still fighting a fire, the Pentagon's still operational, people are coming back to work, and there's this sort of tension, right, of how to make all these things come together safely, but properly, and somehow they fight through this, right? And the fire ultimately is put out, and the Pentagon never really ceases operations.
Yeah, that was a very important decision, I think, on the part, again, of Secretary Rumsfeld. He wanted to keep the Pentagon running as a national symbol, but also to make sure that information got passed. But as you pointed out quite rightfully, the Pentagon is on fire the next morning, on the morning of September 12th. In one corner, at least, of the Pentagon is on fire. And the fire had actually spread and migrated about 100 yards in from the impact point to parts of the A ring, the smallest of the Pentagons. But the other portions of the building were occupied. Now, remember, you've got several hundred firefighters fighting a fire on one side of the building. You have a whole bunch of police, of course, there to shield people so that they don't get too close to the firefighters, first of all, but also to make sure that nobody comes up on the Pentagon to try to make trouble in any way, shape, or form for the people who are fighting the fire or working there. And then you have the actual workers trying to actually go to work. Now, not everybody went to work that day. Several, only a small number of offices were actually able to operate, simply because part of the Pentagon had just been rebuilt and was being, and another part had been emptied. A lot of those people will be ultimately relocated to the rental space that the people who were moved out for the renovations had already been using and moving back from. That rental space will again be used in the Crystal City part of Arlington County, not far away from the Pentagon. But the idea was to try to at least give somebody somewhere else to get their work done. But at the same time, there's a whole bunch of things that have to be done over the course of that day, the 12th of September, because once the fire is extinguished, of course, then you can start doing other things to make sure that the fire, that the building is taken care of. For example, the building has been critically damaged by the passage of a 100-ton airliner and the subsequent fire, so that really a lot of it has been very, very badly crippled that morning. And you have to make sure that the structure is safe so that firefighters can actually go in to continue fighting the fire, and that people can do other things that have to be done there, which will be taking place on later days. Firefighting is the only thing anybody's going to be doing on the 12th. So that means you have to have teams from the Federal Emergency Management Agency and the Military District of Washington Engineer Company, who will go in and they'll actually build supports to hold up the building. They build a crib of like a set of Lincoln logs, where you lay 2 logs in a pair like this and another pair on top of them, and you build a crib around what had been a pillar between them to support the building and keep it safe so people can walk underneath it. That's out of wood. They're using 6x6 timbers to do that. Well, all that is happening all at once, and it's a lot of moving parts, as people would say, and that has to be figured out and solved over the course of that day, and it is successfully. Once the fire is declared controlled, there will actually be pop-up fires that'll start over the next couple of days, because there's still pockets of fuel that haven't burned off yet. But once the fire has been declared controlled, then the search for the dead can take place, then the recovery of them. And in the end, of the 184 victims of the Pentagon attack, 125 from the Pentagon itself and 59 victims from the airliner. I don't count the hijackers there. Of those 184 victims, all but 5 will be recovered and identified. Those 5 unidentified people are 1 person from the airliner, and 2 from the Army, and 2 from the Navy. When I talk about the unidentified, it's a very sensitive subject, obviously, but one has to understand this is a tremendous impact from the airliner of 100 tons crashing into a building, first. And second, the fire gets incredibly hot. It's probably 1,600 degrees Fahrenheit, or twice the temperature of a tabletop candle. This is a really intense fire that burns for a long time in a lot of places. And so it's very, very unlikely that, very, very likely rather, that people are going to be very badly hurt and very badly damaged. Their bodies are going to be very badly damaged by the fire. So it's going to be very hard to identify them. That identification process, once they're removed from the Pentagon, will take place at the Dover Port Mortuary in Dover, Delaware, at Dover Air Force Base. That process will take the better part of a month for that process to take place. And then, of course, once the remains have been identified, they're turned over to the surviving members of their families to have them buried as they deem fit. It's a really complex problem, though, and very difficult to make it all fit together, especially because part of the Pentagon remains a working office building throughout that time.
And so I think we could talk for another few hours, but one last item I just wanted to touch on after the attack. Many of the family members who interact with the Pentagon Memorial Fund talk about the Family Assistance Center, which I think was stood up almost the next day. But there's a certain reverence, a certain fond memory of taking them through very difficult times. I know the military is known for taking care of its lost and the families thereafter, but can you just speak to that sort of part of the book where we talk about what they did in such a short amount of time?
Sure. And I'm glad that you bring that up, because I think we always want to make sure that we take care of somebody who's hurt. That's sensible. That's just human. But on the morning of 9/11, the Office of the Secretary of Defense deputy director for the Office of Family Policy is a woman named Mary Margaret Falk, who's sadly passed away since then. But Meg Falk from Detroit, and she says sometime before noon on the 11th of September to her colleague, "We're going to need a family assistance center." Now, how do you put together a family assistance center? Where do you put a family assistance center for something that is as large as this outside at the Pentagon? You can't put it in the Pentagon because, for the reasons that we just discussed, the Pentagon is still on fire. It's still got a bunch of people working in it. It's got a bunch of police and firefighters around it. You can't put it in the Pentagon. So Meg Falk and her colleagues start calling local hotels, and they eventually find a Sheraton hotel in Crystal City, about a mile from the Pentagon. And they called the hotel and said, "Could we have a meeting room in which we could meet with the families? And we'd like to be able to have them meet there." And the response from the hotel was, "All right, we can make that happen." And they do. They did that without being assured that they could be paid, because no one was certain they were going to be paid. There was nobody was going to pull out a credit card and reserve a meeting room. They just simply offered it initially. Eventually, the Sheraton was compensated for it. But it was more than that, because you had to staff it. Well, Meg Falk, again, knew about the counseling team that had supported the family members of the crew of the USS Cole that had been attacked in Yemen the year before. And she knew that these counselors were available, and she called them and said immediately, "Get yourself packed up and come to Washington, D.C. We need you to start dealing with the families of those killed in the Pentagon, killed and wounded eventually." Aiding that process was that there was a conference of military chaplains in Washington, D.C. Just happened to be scheduled for that week in September 2001. So there were about over 30 military chaplains available, and they made themselves known and available to serve at the Family Assistance Center too. So on the morning of the 12th of September at 9 o'clock, the Sheraton Hotel, by word of mouth, basically, people found out that there was a Family Assistance Center there. And it wasn't just counseling, although that was certainly the most important part of it. It was the fact that you had a whole bunch of other services that would eventually be available to the family members who were dealing with this tremendously grievous event that they were dealing with, and trying to come to grips with it. Well, all of that couldn't have come together without somebody to be in charge, and that person would be an Army Lieutenant General, John von Alstyne. General von Alstyne was an infantry officer. He was the deputy chief of staff he was a deputy chief of staff in the Army at that time. And he decided he was asked to take on the role of being in charge of the Family Assistance Center. And he ran first a set of briefings, and he supervised and oversaw the people who were supporting the family members. He would also make phone calls to make sure that the people he had working for him got the resources they needed. One other thing that General von Alstyne was able to get a commitment from the Department of Defense on was that the families would be hosted at the Sheraton, because military personnel come from across America. They would be hosted at the Department of Defense's expense. So not only did they have a meeting room, but they had hotel rooms and food provided for them at no cost by the Family Assistance Center. And this could be a whole bunch of things. I've mentioned the people who could provide care, counseling, as well as religious support and for people of faith, so that they had somebody to talk to. But it also meant lawyers. My loved one has just passed away in a terrorist attack. What do I do now? How do I get their pay? How do I put in a claim for something so that I can get their pay? What do I do next? How do I arrange this? And all of these services would eventually be provided, indeed, right down to the last detail of a group of therapy dogs that would come. And remember, in many of these cases, those killed had children, so that they would come in and the therapy dogs would enter a room where you'd see children of the loved ones who'd lost a loved one in the attack on the Pentagon. And all of a sudden, the dogs would come in, the children and the adults would go over and simply hug a dog. It was something that the dogs had been trained to respond well to, and it was something that provided a great deal of support to these family members at a very trying time indeed. All of this, I think, is really remarkable and something that was well thought out at the time. And a bunch of people put together the building blocks for it. They were all well trained in their individual specialties, but they improvised this solution to dealing with all this grief, this unimaginable wave of grief from so many people. And General von Alstein really did make it work because he, as I mentioned, I think he would brief the families. Here's the status of what we've identified. Here's how many people we've identified who've been killed. And he did this for a full month. And then he'd take questions. Now, some of those questions could be quite simple, like, General, do you know how I can get my loved one's car out of the parking lot? That's a relatively easy one. And you route them to the Pentagon Defense Protective Service, as it was then called, now the Pentagon Force Protection Agency, the police department. They can get you to the car. But the harder things were, do you know when my loved one's going to be identified? And General von Alstein would take those questions even when somebody started to break down and cry. At that point, he wouldn't just stand there and wait at the podium for the person to ask the question. He'd walk out into the crowd, sit down next to the person who was sobbing, and wait. And he'd listen to them and let them get the question out, repeat the question, and then answer it for everybody who was there. It really did an amazing job of helping people get through this very difficult time. He was very modest about it. He credited Brigadier General Spivey, who was an Air Force Brigadier General chaplain, with having made the difference. I think the General von Alstein did too, because he provided a really good example of how people should deal with people who are suffering so much under these circumstances. The Family Assistance Center then really does deserve the accolade that you gave it. It was a special place, and it gave people a chance to come to grips with what had happened to them and to deal with it in an appropriate way. And I think that's something that everybody involved really deserves a great deal of credit for.
Yeah, I mean, you could feel the trust and that bond even approaching 23 years later. So they certainly did that well, and it was appropriate for the families. So I think we're concluding now because we've probably taken you longer than you wanted to be here. But I do think that what comes out from the book is the story of all these people dealing with situations they never could have anticipated or thought about, and just making do and moving forward even after the attack's over and the response. So the book is so powerful to just better understand what happened. And I really recommend anybody listening to this would pick up the Pentagon 9/11 book and read through it, because it's very helpful to understand what particularly happened at the Pentagon that day.
Yeah.
Is there anything else we haven't covered that you like to talk about?
Sure. And a couple of things. The Pentagon 9/11 is available digitally on the Office of the Secretary of Defense Historian's Office website. So people don't even have to. I prefer it if they pick up a book, although as a government product, I make no money from that. But I think if people want to get access to it and read small segments specifically about the attack or the response, I think it's a good opportunity to do so. I would also say that it's important for people to take a look at it, just simply to maybe condition their mind and think about, what do I do in the case of a disaster? How would I respond to it? What sort of preparation could I reasonably make between now and then, so that I'm prepared for something that we hope never happens, but maybe just devote a few minutes of thought to. If nothing else, what would I do in case of a building fire in a place that I'm at my workplace? Where would I meet my colleagues to make sure everybody got out safely? That sort of thinking is prudent and I think smart. And I think the book teaches us. I certainly learned a lot in helping to write it about those sorts of questions. I think that other people could too. It really does say, however, that fundamentally how we as Americans treat one another is and how well we can treat one another under such trying circumstances is really an example of some really well thought out and well-meaning people who did the right thing that day.
Well said. Thank you so much for your time today, Doctor, and we look forward to continued discussions with you.
Thank you very much. Real pleasure. Thank you for hosting me.
Great.
Thanks for listening to the National 9/11 Pentagon Memorial Podcast. Be sure to click subscribe to stay up to date and be the first to hear about our future podcasts. You can also find and subscribe to the podcast on Podbean, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and YouTube.